Hello, so in this video I'm going to do topic 4 revision for civil rights in the USA 1850 to 2009. This is part of Edexcel A-level history, and as with the other revision videos I've done for this paper, first I'm going to talk through the specification, then I'm going to go through the content in terms of a timeline, then I'm going to break down the content, and then I'm going to talk through some past questions. So as ever, if you've got any questions, anything you want me to go into more detail on, or anything that needs clarifying, please leave a comment below. All right, so in terms of the specification, this is really chronological. There's two main points. Civil rights activities 54 to 63, and then increasing divisions really kind of post 64, 65 up to 68. So in terms of the first bullet point, it really starts with the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 54, which overturns kind of segregated schooling, and it says that segregated schooling is unconstitutional. That leads to the Brown 2 decision in 55, and then moving on to Little Rock, Arkansas, where Eisenhower intervenes to ensure that the public school in Little Rock is desegregated, and that's a really useful example of federal government intervention to uphold civil rights. Between those two events, the Brown decision and Little Rock, is the Montgomery bus boycott led by Martin Luther King, which culminates in Browder versus Gale decision in 56 and a success for the movement there. So this really promotes Martin Luther King into kind of national consciousness, and it leads to the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, so a Southern-based civil rights organization which becomes very, very influential, throughout the late 50s and into the mid 60s and beyond. Also, we've got SNCC and the sit-ins in 1960, and CORE with the Freedom Rides in 61, and then we've got the legislation which follows this protest. So we've got the Civil Rights Act of 64, which is the end of Jim Crow. It ends segregation in the South. We've got the Voting Rights Act in 65, which is a result of campaigning, particularly the Selma March in 65, led by Martin Luther King, and also the Civil Rights Act of 1968, the Fair Housing Act. All of these pieces of legislation are passed during the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, so it's important to know about the role of Lyndon Johnson in those and his approach as a politician. Moving on to the second bullet point, increasing divisions. So from about 65 onwards, SNCC and CORE start to expel whites, and you get kind of black power coming to the fore. You get the growth of Black Panthers from 66 onwards. Up until 65, you've got Malcolm X offering an alternative, a challenge to Martin Luther King. Malcolm X is based in the North and really challenges Martin Luther King's peaceful, non-violent Christian approach. In 67, you have Martin Luther King speaking out on the Vietnam War, which really severs ties between the movement led by MLK and Lyndon Johnson and the Johnson administration. Johnson doesn't want to hear it and is critical of Martin Luther King speaking out on the Vietnam War. 68 is the assassination of Martin Luther King, which leads to widespread rioting across the US, particularly in northern cities and kind of ghetto areas. Okay, so here's the timeline, and I've talked through lots of these already. There's just a little bit more detail here. Really, the story is about the story of this topic is about the way that the movement progresses and the really significant wins for the movement, starting with Brown versus Board of Education. We've got to remember that was pushed to the Supreme Court by the NAACP, so it wasn't just that out of nowhere the Supreme Court makes this decision. That case was pushed to the Supreme Court by the NAACP, so that was Black American protest and campaigning that led to that decision. Then we've got the Brown 2 decision and the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott in 55, as well as the Emmett Till case. And I've put the Emmett Till case here because I think it really highlights the fact that Black Americans didn't have equal protection under the law. And if you read about that case and the way that case was dealt with, it really just highlights that Black Americans didn't have, a fair trial. For example, there wasn't that just didn't happen in the South. 56 is the end of the Montgomery bus boycott and the Browder versus Gale decision, so a win for that economic boycott, that protest. In 57, we've got the creation of the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Martin Luther King, as well as events in Little Rock. Again, this government intervention really highlighting the importance of federal government intervention to kind of uphold Black American civil rights. Cooper versus Aaron, further promoting the desegregation of schools. Then we've got the sit-ins led by SNCC, really effective, non-violent, peaceful protest, effectively using the media, and that becomes really important in this period, the media portrayal, which elicits sympathy from particularly northern whites. And then Freedom Rides, led by CORE, another significant protest, and it's widely reported on, highlighting the kind of hypocrisy of and the violence of the Jim Crow South. In 63, we've got the peaceful protest in Birmingham, Alabama, which is really, really clamped down on heavily by Bull Connor in Birmingham, highlighting, again, just the violence that the Black Americans experienced in the South, and the effective use of the media by Martin Luther King. The March on Washington, I Have a Dream speech. I don't think I need to say a huge amount about that, but 250,000 people attend the march, and it's beamed around the world. It's a hugely significant moment, although it is criticised by people like Malcolm X, who called it a picnic. He called it a farce on Washington, said it didn't really make any difference. JFK, as a response to kind of Birmingham, speaks out on civil rights and calls it a moral issue. So it's not an issue for Democrats or Republicans. It's not North and South. It's a moral issue. It's kind of right or wrong. And he introduces a civil rights bill, which doesn't get passed in his lifetime, but it's passed the next year in 64 by Lyndon Johnson, who had been Kennedy's vice president. He becomes president in November 63. Also in 64, we've got the SNCC's Freedom Summer, kind of voter registration in Mississippi, which is not massively successful, but highlights the importance of getting people registered to vote, which becomes important post 65 with the Voting Rights Act. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, War on Poverty, starts in 64, which does decrease poverty, but then gets it does get derailed by the Vietnam War. 65, March from Selma to Montgomery leads to the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act adds 250,000 Black American voters to the South by the end of 1965, so hugely significant. Assassination of Malcolm X in 65, and the Watts riots in 65. And I think something to say about the Watts riots is what that really highlights is, despite the legislative changes which have mainly affected Black Americans in the South, northern socioeconomic ghetto issues are getting worse because of things like white flight and the Vietnam War, and the Watts riots really highlight that. The Watts riots are also a kind of turning point for some whites in the North who say, civil rights has kind of gone far enough, and that they're less kind of sympathetic post Watts. 66, Stokely Carmichael coins Black Power, whites expelled from SNCC. I've mentioned that already. The Black Powers have formed an MLK's Chicago campaign, which isn't successful. So you can see 65 is probably, or 64, 65, probably the pinnacle of the civil rights movement. 66 is things are starting to change. Increasing divisions, Martin Luther King less successful in the North, trying to combat housing issues, socioeconomic issues. The Black Panthers formed almost as a response to these socioeconomic issues, thinking about housing, thinking about policing, thinking about poverty, education, those kind of things. 67, riots in Detroit and Newark, again highlighting socioeconomic issues, police brutality. 67, as I mentioned before, Martin Luther King speaks out on the Vietnam War. In 68, Martin Luther King starts his Poor People's Campaign, tried to be kind of more inclusive, it's more class-based. Martin Luther King moves towards kind of socialism. He's assassinated in 68, and the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, is passed in 68, which is attempts to address discrimination in housing, but really is quite toothless and isn't able to really fully address that. So that's the story of topic 4. It is the topic with the most content, so there's a lot to get your head around. But what I would say is it's really important to kind of understand the story. Think of it as a story. Think of it, starts with the NAACP campaigning for the Brown decision, and that gets the ball rolling, and it ends with the assassination of Martin Luther King, and those increasing divisions. Okay, moving on to the content breakdown. There's many ways you could address this because there's quite a lot to this topic. But if we start with motivating factors, what are the things that are driving positive change here? So obviously we've got the movement, the civil rights movement, we've got Black American campaigning. You could break that down into groups. Martin Luther King could be a paragraph. Malcolm X could be a paragraph. SNCC and CORE could be a paragraph. Or you could talk about the movement as a whole. Then we've got the US government. Presidents, so Kennedy and Johnson, Eisenhower even, did in their own different ways promote civil rights. The Supreme Court too, with key decisions. So again, you could have a US government as one paragraph, or you could break it down. The media is really important here. The effective use of the media by civil rights groups, Martin Luther King and those campaigns. Also external factors like the Cold War. And in 1957, when Sputnik was going around the Earth, it did highlight that there was a message sent saying Sputnik is now over Little Rock, to really highlight the hypocrisy of America being the land of the free, the beacon of democracy and freedom, and yet Black Americans couldn't vote and were segregated against and discriminated against. So the Cold War did play a role in influencing the government. In terms of obstacles, we've got white attitude. So you could talk about things like the White Citizens Councils, the backlash post-Watts, white attitudes, holding back. You could talk about Emmett Till there as well. So holding back civil rights. Also, another obstacle is divisions, increasing divisions. You could talk about North versus South. You could talk about kind of young versus old. You could talk about violent, non-violent, even if it's not particularly violent. Black Panthers and Malcolm X I think they probably wouldn't say they were promoting violence. Well, they did say they weren't promoting violence, but certainly in the eyes of the media, that was the way they were presented compared to Martin Luther King. And then another obstacle is Vietnam and the way that it deflected attention from the Great Society, and increasing socioeconomic issues, which you can maybe put under the Vietnam War or almost an obstacle on its own. And then in terms of social, political, economic, social rights in terms of the significant changes, Civil Rights Act, ending Jim Crow, the Brown decision, desegregating schooling, and then increasing ghetto issues as a kind of counterpoint. You could talk about maybe Watts there. In terms of political rights, we've obviously got the Voting Rights Act, we've got significant and symbolic support from the government, but then a counterpoint, Johnson splitting from Martin Luther King post-67. In terms of economic rights, we've got the end of Jim Crow potentially opening up opportunities for Black Americans, but we've also got continuing socioeconomic issues, particularly in northern cities. So you've got riots in Watts, Detroit, Newark, also in Harlem. There's a riot in '64. So if you break down the content in this way, that will definitely help with your revision. Okay, finally onto the past questions. So in 2022, the question was, it was the activities of SNCC and CORE that were mainly responsible for improvements in the lives of Black Americans in the years 57 to 68. How far do you agree? So this is a motivating factors question. What was responsible for the improvements of the lives of Black Americans? Paragraph 1, SNCC and CORE. Paragraph 2, you could talk about the wider movement, Martin Luther King, or you could talk about Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, anything like that. Paragraph 3, you could talk about the government actions, legislation. You could look at the dates. That's really important here, 57 to 68. So you're probably not going to talk about, you shouldn't talk about the Brown decision, but you could talk about Little Rock, Eisenhower. You could talk about the Civil Rights Act of 64, and you could talk about the Voting Rights Act of 65, maybe the Civil Rights Act of 68 as well. The second question in 2019, how accurate is it to say the status of Black people in the United States changed very little in the years 54 to 63? So we're talking about the status of black people, to what extent that changed. And look at the dates again here, 54 to 63. I would suggest a social, political, and economic approach. So paragraph on social rights, paragraph on political rights, paragraph on economic rights. Thinking about evidence that shows either change or continuity for each of those. And then finally, last question, question 3, how accurate is it to say that it was primarily internal divisions within the civil rights movement that damaged the cause of civil rights for black Americans in the years 60 to 68? So you could talk about divisions, you could talk about white attitudes as another paragraph, you could talk about the Vietnam War, possibly you could talk about maybe government backlash, something like that, if you or lack of government support, possibly. But I would probably go for divisions, white attitudes, and Vietnam War there as the paragraphs. As ever, these are just suggestions. If you can think of a better way, if you've got other ways of approaching this, that's absolutely great. So I hope that was useful. Please leave a comment if you've got any questions or you need anything clarifying. Thank you.